Today on Everyday Injustice, we bring in Daniel Forkkio. He's based in New York right now, and he's with Represent Justice. Welcome to our show.
Thank you, David. So nice to be here.
So I was reading up about your organization, and the thing that caught my attention was storytelling,
Mhm.
which I think is the most important aspect of criminal justice reform there is.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that, you can give stats and show studies up the yin yang, and honestly, it just goes over people's heads. What
Mhm.
people need to do is be able to humanize people that are caught in the criminal legal system. And so
Yes.
storytelling is like the key component. I wanted to start, I guess let's start with talking about what represent justice is, and then we can talk about how you got here.
Absolutely. Represent Justice is a national organization that works to build the power, the narrative power specifically, of people who are formerly incarcerated around the country. Our belief is that an empowered story and a person who has been shown worth and dignity sharing their story is an important contributor to changing the justice system and changing people's opinions about the justice system. So we work with filmmakers to organize storytelling campaigns around the real world people that their films cover. We work with what we call ambassadors around the country to train them how to share their story, how to produce films about their story, and we support impact campaigns around storytelling with authentic stories at the center all around the country. We've helped to pass laws, we've helped to change different cultural institutions' beliefs around the justice system. It's all storytelling all the time, but with a huge belief in dignity and the power of authenticity for people who are formerly incarcerated at the center of it.
So, how did you get to this space?
So I was in Los Angeles 6 years ago, more than 6 years ago, actually, 2019, right before the Just Mercy film came out. Just Mercy, for folks that don't know, is a film that's about Brian Stevenson as well as the wrongful conviction of a man named Walter McMillan in Monroeville, Alabama. And Brian Stevenson wrote a book called Just Mercy that talks about the justice system and the history of the justice system, and as well as this one case. It was going to come out as a film at the end of 2019. I was in LA working at a college access organization, helping kids get into college, which is something that's very near and dear to my heart and my personal story. And I was approached by a Hollywood producer turned advocate named Scott Budnick, who's very well known in California. Scott was producing the Just Mercy film, and he invited me to help support the campaign. The film campaign existed mostly as a concept at that point. It wasn't sort of a structure to get this film out there. So we built a campaign, and over the course of the next 6 or 7 months, I helped to get the film all around the country, screenings for governors, screenings for legislators, other different types of activities, all focused on the film being a way to create conversation around the justice system. And wrongful conviction is something that everybody can sort of get behind, the idea that the system makes mistakes and should be accountable for those mistakes. And if the system makes mistakes when it comes to the death penalty, which is at the center of the film, that's a really, really strong signal that the system needs to change. And so during that campaign, we had this program called our ambassadors. And ambassadors were people with lived experience who would show up and sort of be spokespeople for the film. So they would show up when a film was being screened, they would tell their story after the film, they would sort of be panel participants, but in service of this big feature film. And one of the things that really struck me around those screenings, we did over 600 screenings of the Just Mercy film. One thing that really struck me was that people with real world experience becoming empowered and sharing their stories were stealing the show in almost every theater, in almost every space that the film was playing. Their stories became the centerpiece. And it was really their stories that would cause audience members to stand up and want to share their own story and want to share their own beliefs about the justice system. And it was incredibly moving, and it led me to launch Represent Justice as a nonprofit organization so that we could do it all the time with all types of stories.
One thing I was um actually just watched Just Mercy again a few weeks ago,
Right.
and what caught my attention was the 60-minute episode of Walter McMillan's case.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what was really interesting just watching that was how faithful the characters in the movie were to real life. Like even the mannerisms of the guy that was in prison was almost
Hmm.
spot on. Like you never
Hmm.
see that.
Yeah, yeah. Folks are super, super talented. The unfortunate thing is that people who really went through it don't often get the opportunity to produce or to act. The cases in which people are able to authentically represent their own story on screen or even behind the screen as a producer are very, very rare. And that was part of our motivation for the ambassador program. It's like, there can be a stellar actor who captures exactly a setting and a moment in this incredible way, but we could make it so much more frequent if it was a person with lived experience behind the camera or in front of the camera, because they're just able to tell you exactly what happened in vivid detail, and you can see it and you can understand it, and you know that it's authentic, and you know that something has to be done about it. So that authenticity, I think, is really the key. When a person who went through it is able to share their story and feel empowered about it and not extracted from, you can see audiences change their minds and their belief systems by the thousands quickly. And that's the really special thing about storytelling.
Yeah, and last year I got to go to the first annual San Quentin Film
Mm,
Festival, and I'm going to go again in a few weeks to the second one.
great.
But that was just a mind-boggling experience
Yeah.
because you get to meet so many people and you get to interact with people as people. And, one of the things, and I keep bringing this up on these shows, is that, once you get to know people, they really become people. They're not the worst thing they've ever done. I know that's a statement right out of Brian Stevenson as well.
That's right.
But it's true. It's like, and y- I think a lot of people think, oh, incarcerated people, jail, prison, scary place, and it can be. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. Like my friend in incarcerated said, yeah, this is still a scary place. It's just
Hmm.
there's a lot of programming now, and so people have the opportunity to do things they never did before.
Hmm.
And it seems like you guys are really focused on that aspect of things.
Absolutely. And by the way, so I was at that festival and we had a few of our films screen. And this year, I'm happy to announce that we will again be part of the official selection. There's a film that we co-produced called Chasing Redemption by one of our ambassadors named Tyson. And it's a beautiful look at people who've been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. In the US, it's kind of unique. We are the only country, I believe, at this point that sentences kids under the age of 18 with all of the prevalent science about frontal lobe development and the fact that those that kids are capable of redemption. We sentence kids to life without parole. And so there are people in the justice system who've been doing time for 40, 50, 60, 70 years in some cases, and they were sentenced as teenagers. And it's a rare and especially cruel thing that happens in the US. It also, of course, happens to adults. Adults can be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Again, despite the fact that there's a lot of evidence, especially when it comes to violent crime, that violence happens in a particular period in your life is often not repeated. And there are so many rehabilitative measures that you can take. And over time, there's so much that you can understand about a person's likelihood to ever commit violence again. But we have these laws, we have these rules around the country. The film Chasing Redemption, which is one of the official selections, so you'll get to see it, is about life without the possibility of parole. And it's about folks that have completely transformed their life in California, but who have not been given, in some cases, the opportunity to leave. And so I think it's really, really important when we look at our justice system, it's not a data-driven justice system. You can look at the amount that we spend and what our practices are, and the fact that we are not safe, that we have safety challenges as a country, and say that this is not working. Something has got to change. And so I think it's super, super important that stories shift this irrational perspective around people who have been incarcerated and what it means to create a safe environment for all of us. And so the stories that we share are all about that humanization, potential, other opportunities, other approaches to transformation. And so Chasing Redemption will be there, and there will be so many other films, and it'll be a beautiful experience because it's being held inside of it's being held for people who are not usually able to access that type of storytelling. And so very, very proud to be partnering.
And it's really important because, first of all, from the perspective of the public, they need to kind of understand what's going on, but
Mhm.
also from the perspective of some of the guys. I've been at various programs. I mean, there have been stories where, the guy lost his daughter in a
Mhm.
tragic car accident. He had just reunited with her and she was corresponding and coming to visit. And
Mhm.
his first chance to really open up happened in front of an audience of 175 people. And
Mhm.
he didn't get to go to her funeral, but it
Mhm.
was like he got to bury her that day
Mhm.
in front of all of us.
And when it's done in a way that protects the mental and psychological safety of the person with the story, and when it's done in reciprocity with the person who has the story, meaning, we deeply believe that a person who goes through the emotional labor of reliving trauma should be compensated fairly, should be in a place of choosing or not choosing to do it. But you're right, there can be an incredible catharsis, there can be an incredible healing, and it starts not necessarily with the audience perception of your story. It really starts with your own perception of your personal story. When you start to identify the contributing factors that led to your incarceration, whether it was adverse childhood experiences, which we now know very, very well are determinants of incarceration, you get to reframe who you are. You get to go back to being a person who deserves love. You get to go back to being a person who is a hero in your own right, capable of contributing in amazing ways. So really, it starts with reframing your own story and then allowing other people into that who can now change their perceptions around you and around people in your community. That's some of the greatest relief that you can provide yourself. So we deeply believe in it.
So let me ask you this, because,
Mhm.
one of the interesting things about the release of Just Mercy was, 2019, 2020 was kind of the peak of, unfortunately, of criminal justice reform. And, I remember seeing Just Mercy like literally days before the pandemic shut
Hmm.
everything down.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the high point, and then we had the George Floyd stuff that happened, and then crime went back up, which should have been obvious that
Hmm.
it was going to happen during the pandemic with everything disrupted in everybody's life. And then people have kind of slid back in the other direction. From
Hmm.
your perspective, as somebody who's in this space and also telling stories, how have you seen that change?
The tricky thing about narrative, and I think we could all do to just sort of understand and recognize the narratives that are being presented to us in media more readily. I wish for greater media literacy for us as a country, and I wish for really savvy, thoughtful consumption of media. The tricky thing about narrative is when something is labeled, you can develop a cynicism around it. You can think, well, I've already seen everything and I know everything there is to know about this label, criminal justice reform or the prison system, whatever it is. And you become lazy as new data is presented to you, you start to attach it to this thing that you think you've already thought through. Despite the fact that you might not know that 1 out of every 10 people who's been put to death has later been proven to be innocent, or you might not know that adolescent brain science tells us that your frontal lobe develops into your late 20s, and yet there are people who can be put in handcuffs and given no chance at freedom at 15 years old around the country. So you might not have all the facts, but you've assigned a label to it that has given you comfort and told you that you know everything there is to know. Criminal justice reform can be like that. People can sort of see things at a high point like 2020 or even 2019 and say, well, yeah, that was the conversation then, but things are different now. And in 2022 and 2023, I heard a lot of media that there was a crime wave, and so therefore this is no longer something that I support. If you think for even a moment, if you can take the time and listen to a story from a real person who's going through the many public health failures and other types of social system failures that contribute to violence or to crime, you can already tell that, of course, a pandemic would create a rash of those types of offenses. Of course they would. And if you take time to listen and think about statistics of crime and other things, you'll see that already we're back below pre-pandemic levels in terms of crime around the country. And yet you're still getting a lot of these headlines, and yet you're still hearing a lot of these stories. It's unfortunate. And, our contribution to that work is, of course, to put authentic stories out there as much as we can. I think criminal justice reform, it's so much more broad than just sentencing and what happens when you're inside a facility. It's housing. It is access to substance abuse treatment. We have an ambassador who just produced a film called The Cure Complex, John Medina, and it looks at in San Francisco the different types of approaches to treating addiction and the trade-offs. Addiction that is treated pharmaceutically has some trade-offs. It creates some dependency. Addiction that is treated in terms of your internal self-worth and more root causes allows for a different approach. And that approach can keep you out of prison. So I think we need to take a broader look at justice reform and what it means. And we need to take a closer look at why we are getting media headlines that tell us information that is out of context or not true. And that's kind of that's what the work is at Represent Justice, putting the true narratives out there while empowering storytellers to share their own stories.
And I think, a lot of what you said is really important. But, for me, as somebody who goes into the court all the time and sees kind of the front end and then works with people that are incarcerated and gets to see the back end, it really comes down to, housing security. It
Mhm.
comes down to substance use disorder,
Mhm.
and it comes down to mental illness. And I think, we don't even look at mental illness broadly enough because, we think, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and we should be thinking about trauma and all sorts of other
Mhm.
stuff, which is not
Of course.
necessarily what we classically think of as mental illness, but plays a huge role. I mean,
Exactly.
I know like the stats, and I'm a stats guy, show that, first of all, there's the saying, hurt people.
Mhm.
And that intergenerational trauma and the fact that, these guys and these women grow up in situations where they're often victims of abuse, of crime, of neglect, of
Mhm.
poverty, and then they carry that on.
Of
And,
course.
part of the key for people to kind of get past that, I hate that word, by the way,
Mhm.
but for lack of a better phrase, part of the key is for them to kind of deal with those childhood and past traumas and
Mhm.
be able to figure out, okay, what can I do now? And we're finally starting to give the tools in the incarcerated setting for a lot of people to be able to do that. It took a long time to get education programs back, to get training programs back, to get all these structural programs that can help people move on.
Hmm.
Because the last thing we want is, for somebody to do their time and then get released, and they haven't addressed any of these issues.
Exactly. And it's even deeper than that. If we're really going to build towards a just society, I think one thing that's super important for folks to understand who haven't been impacted directly is there are only a few layers from having gone through the same thing. I mean, depending on what zip code you're from, depending on what specific services, what school you went to, all of the different public health failures and social system failures, they can reach you in a second. And probably they've reached a family member of yours that you may not be aware of or haven't talked about. And so I think the piece of understanding that none of us are above or even drastically different from people who are being impacted by the justice system, and that we all have a responsibility to create the conditions in an environment that is supportive and that makes this less likely. The way our schools should have nurses, the way we shouldn't over rely on discretionary discipline. I went to a school where we had more police officers than we did have nurses. And if I had shown up the wrong way, which sometimes I felt like doing, I could have had a very different type of interaction. And from that interaction, the data shows I could have had very different outcomes. And so there are things, and this is why this work is systemic, there are things that make these outcomes more likely. We need to know what they are, and we need to build opinion around changing them. And it starts with a story. It starts with the courage to share a story. It starts with the courage to connect to someone else's story. Just a really quick story, just by that point, we have an ambassador from Louisiana who runs the Louisiana Parole Project. Andrew Hunley does phenomenal work. Andrew Hunley was part of our program and produced a film about the power of commutations. So in this case, it was the power of people getting second chances. Through his work, it's a reentry organization. So they meet people who have gotten a second chance and they get to follow them around and make sure that they have gotten the resources they need. In that film, he shows how a person who received a commutation went back to the community, went back to the person that they had wronged, and they completely were able to reconcile and change their opinions of one another and completely showcase what it is to heal, truly to give back. And he shared that, he screened that film for the governor of Louisiana, the Democratic governor at the time. And in the final months of that governor's time as governor, they did more commutations. This is Governor John Bell Edwards, did more commutations than in the first 3.5 years of their governorship. Um, in individual, being able to see a story and think about what can they do can have tremendous impact. And so I think it's on all of us to listen to someone's story that has gone through something that we haven't gone through.
Yeah, and you jumped my next question, which was to highlight one of your campaigns. But I mean, you mentioned something else that I think is really important, and that is I'm a big believer in restorative justice, and
Hmm.
I feel like, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support this view that, we think of, kind of the punitive system as helping victims, but really, throwing somebody in a cage really doesn't help victims.
That's right.
It may temporarily make them feel safer because the person can't hurt them or someone else. And I get that. And I don't
Hmm.
want to, dismiss that or diminish it. But at the same time, it seems like, a much better approach, and they've done it in places as diverse as Texas,
Yeah.
is victim offender reconciliation
Hmm.
programs and all sorts of circle programs and all sorts of things that we can do now that we maybe didn't know about 30, 40 years ago.
That's exactly right. And the one of the best leaders on that specific frame, the victims' rights movement, the history of it, and how it doesn't ultimately, how the justice system doesn't serve the voices of victims is Lenore Anderson, who wrote a book called In Their Names, which is a very good book. Folks should
Yes,
definitely read
I've
it.
read that.
And so you're absolutely right that we have to kind of tackle this myth that the way that the justice system functions is in service of victims. Victims are often ignored, often not connected to resources, and are often used as tools for prosecution without any thought of their peace or what is ultimately going to bring them calm and repair and restoration. And that is true around the country, and I think that is something that people really need to understand. I think restorative justice is so important. We have folks who have produced films about restorative justice work. There's an organization called Healing Dialogue and Action in California that does restorative justice work. They're phenomenal. We need more stories of restorative justice working. It's a really powerful and heart-wrenching thing to watch. And so in terms of capturing it responsibly and making sure that you are protecting the, like I said, psychological safety of everybody participating, it's very difficult. But when it's done really well, you're able to see the alternative to just endless punishment. And it's really important. So thank you for bringing that up. Restorative justice is a huge thing that I wish would be more available and accessible to people around the country.
Yeah, and toward the, dismissing victims thing, I mean, we just saw an execution in Alabama
Mhm.
where the victim said, "Don't execute the
That's right.
person."
That's
And
right.
then, the other point that we made earlier is that often victims become involved in the criminal justice system
Of
because
course.
they haven't been treated well and we haven't dealt with those traumas. And so, once again, hurt people. And
Hmm.
so, like, I get that people are frustrated when there's crime that's happening,
Sure.
outside of in their neighborhoods, outside of their doors, on the streets, where they don't feel safe.
Of course.
But, part of my problem is that, people don't look into enough what really will protect them, and
That's exactly
simply
right.
locking somebody in a cage is so 19th century.
That's right.
And not to make light of it, but I mean, we should be a lot further along than we are.
Of course. And even if to bring it back to storytelling, if you look at futuristically told stories and throughout pop culture and film and media, there are no good futures that describe and depict an over-reliance on prisons, policing, or the justice system. If you look at what an enlightened society is, as far as it's been imagined by any writer, author, storyteller, futurist, predictor, philosopher, any depiction in which the entire society runs based on the control of police or the state, but certainly police, prisons, and judges show that we missed the mark in a major way. We missed an opportunity to build a safer future in a major way. Those are dystopian societies where it's incredibly classist. People are not able to get their basic needs met. So that's not the future that we want, even at a gut level of of public opinion. So why not start building it now? Why not start listening to people that have these stories, that have the answers and the solutions of what's going wrong in communities now? And that's our call for people. Start to listen now. There is often an action that you can take in your local community right now, a political action in some cases, a donate action, volunteerism. There are things that you can do now to build a safer future. And that's what we hope for people. That's what we hope people will get out of the films that we produce.
So one last question. How is it that you measure success, especially when it comes to narrative change?
Yeah. So all of our films are message tested. We work with our ambassadors to craft questions about the subject matter that they either went through or that is central to their story. We craft questions about level of concern from the audience. We craft questions about level of support for a solution. And we message test by asking those questions, showing the film, and then asking those questions again to a control group, or not to a control group, to a treatment group within that ambassador's community. We look at the differences pre and post. We look and see, did people's knowledge increase? Did their level of concern, things like how How disturbed are you by the behavior of the judge in this video, the comments of the judge in this video? How disturbed are you by the behavior of the neglectful social worker in this video? How likely would you be to support this type of legislation or whatever the case might be? We look at those things and we see those shifts, and we can extrapolate that when the film is seen by thousands of people, 5,000, tens of thousands, whatever it might be, those are the types of public opinion shifts that are happening in the room. Then we survey audiences. So depending on the type of screening or event, whether it's a campaign rally, whether it's just kind of a screening with a college or a university, we survey the audiences. What are you willing to do now? What did you learn? How are you feeling about changing the system and getting involved in your local community? We look at those responses, and that shows people more deeply engaging. And so that's kind of what we're looking for. We're looking to extrapolate that when people watch the film, they're being better educated, their level of concern is increasing, and it's leading to increasing support. And then it's get the film in as many places as possible. Obviously, if there's a political action, we're going to measure it by the advocacy actions. And so if we've got letter writing tools, advocacy toolkits, and things like that. And so people will write their legislator or write their council member. We had a film called $1 Million Cage that was about the youth justice system in Los Angeles. Los Angeles spends, and California spends, a lot of money on its youth justice system, which recently transitioned to the responsibility of individual counties. The term $1 Million Cage, which our ambassador Kent Mendoza, who's a director at ARC, very large organization doing effective work in California, was that they're spending $1 million per kid. I mean, just imagine that level of expenditure, but there is almost no mentorship happening, no education, no real services being provided to these kids. The film walked through Kent's experience, Kent's advocacy to create an alternative Department of Youth Development in Los Angeles and to get it funded. And of course, the point is being made that look how much money you're spending on something that isn't working. Why would you not spend a fraction of that on something that has the potential to be transformative? And I lived it and I know it. And so that's an example where that film was screened for a board of supervisors. It was embedded into the advocacy locally. And as a result, it was a contributing factor to what is now the DYD and a lot of advocacy that Kent has been able to do to get that funded. So we measure it campaign by campaign, but broadly, we're looking for surveys, we're looking for message testing, and we're looking for advocacy. And last thing I'll say is we're also looking for new partnerships. When an ambassador or storyteller is able to engage a new institution or a new organization to make them grapple with this issue of justice that they've never met before, that's success happening as well. And because we're a national organization, we're able to present those types of partnerships and that type of networking as well.
So as we were talking, I just clicked on your speakers bureau on your website, and I see Dolores and Jack Morris there, both of who came here to speak earlier this year on the strike.
Excellent.
So that's awesome to see. How can people learn more? I mean, obviously you have your website, representjustice.org. Do you
Yes.
have other suggestions?
Well, I think because you can view almost every film and story on the website, it really is the go-to place for coming up with your own entry point. And what I would tell people, it's representjustice.org. Start with a story that resonates to you. Choose the way you would choose in any context of wanting to hear something. You're going to see a title and maybe $1 Million Cage kind of resonates with you. You might see a title called The Cure Complex, and the undertones of overcoming addiction might resonate with you. Watch something that feels true to you. Learn about its connection to the justice system or its role in creating incarceration. Learn about the person and support the campaign that is presented on that action page. And it's a low barrier of entry, but it's how you start to rewire your brain around this issue and think more thoughtfully about the future that you want to see. So go to representjustice.org, watch something, take an action specific to that campaign page, follow us at We Rep Justice, and just start to change the way that you think about the justice system in your local community. And everyone has a role to play when it comes to narrative. Narrative is the sum of all of us, what we accept, what we say. Take a stand by watching something and changing the way that you think, and then take a specific action after you've seen one of these films, and just join the ride. Join the ride. It's time to be a part of the change.
Great. Well, we've been talking with Daniel Forkkio. He is the CEO of Represent Justice. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.